God. So in his letter to the Ephesians, I'm going to go back a little bit to 2:8. So the argument here that Paul's making in Ephesians is the fact that we have salvation, right, by grace. And we have salvation by grace, and then don't get that through works. So I'm going to start off here with Ephesians 2, and we're going to go about 10 verses here. So let's listen for the word of the Lord. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God, not the result of works, so that one may boast. For we are what he has made us, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand to be our way of life. So then, remember that at one time you Gentiles by birth, called the uncircumcision, by those who called the circumcision, a physical circumcision made in the flesh by human hands. Remember that you were at that time without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, who were once far off, have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he is our peace. In his flesh, he has made both groups into one and has broken down the dividing wall that is hostility between us. He has abolished the law with its commandments and ordinances, that he might create in himself, getting messages here, that he might create in himself one new humanity in place of the two, thus making peace, and might reconcile both groups to God in one body through the cross, thus putting to death that hostility through it. So he came and proclaimed peace to you who were far off, and peace to those who were near. For through him, both of us have access to one Spirit, in one Spirit to the Father. So then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are citizens with the saints and also members of the household of God. So ends this reading of the word of the Lord. All thanks be to God. So I'm going to drop this so I can see some of your faces as we do that. What's your reaction to that? First of all, is there any questions about it? Is it too dense for anybody? Beth, your hand was up.
Only because it just, when you were reading it, it just brought something to mind. It has nothing at all to do with what we're talking about tonight. But the whole concept about the circumcision or how did that start with the Jews?
Well,
that's a Sherry question.
I was wondering the same thing, Beth.
So here you go.
I know. Right, I'm sorry. It just was kind of like.
So we're all adults here, right? Okay.
Let me check. All right, we're good.
So they wanted to. So when you read in the Old Testament, you hear about Gilgal. Remember that? You remember hearing about Gilgal? And that was one of the spots that was first. One of the first worship spots in way back in the times of just post Abraham. So anyway, they needed to be marked. So they came up with this circumcision. So this whenever I say Gilgal, I giggle about it. So Gilgal is actually Hebrew for mountain of foreskins.
I'm sorry, what? Mountain of what?
Mountain of foreskins.
Oh God!
I see why you giggle.
This is why sometimes the Bible's fun, you know. So this was the mark, right? That God has told his people, this is how you would be marked. So that's the circumcision. So all good Jews and observant Jews were circumcised. I will say this, even though we don't know exactly how it starts. Many of the food commandments that we see are about, if we look at them, they can prevent food poisoning and food rotting and things like that.
Mhm.
So there's a very public health aspect to it. So we know that circumcision does that too. So, but in here, this is much later. This is Paul talking. It's probably about 25 years after the death and resurrection of Christ. He's talking about people who were Jewish, and then Gentiles, non-Jews, who were not circumcised.
Right.
Yeah. And that was the big argument in the church. The big argument in the church was that was Christianity a subset of being a Hebrew, right, Jewish, or was it really salvation for all people who were outside of the Jewish faith? And that was a big issue. That was a really, really big issue within the early church. So I read that because it's two people who are different physically, right? Two groups of people that are different physically, but they come together of one mind because of this event, the person and the work of Jesus Christ.
So now we can get back to the topic at hand. I'm sorry.
Right. Now you know, right? You'll get.
Yep.
You're all gonna laugh at that point from that point forward. So, so the reason why I read that is the fact that when we look at that, we can see that this racism, it is not an issue that is new, right? It has been around for a long time. As long as there have been marked differences between people in the way that they look, or the way that they talk, or there's something that's been allowed people to be grouped. It's usually resulted in one group being excluded to certain extents. And we're no different. I mean, we certainly have a pretty horrific, no different than the world, but in this country, we have a pretty horrific record when we take a look at what our Constitution says, and but then we realize that we allowed slavery, and then we had in addition to own slavery, we had indentured servitude for a long, long time, and we had a lot of immigrants that came in, whether they be Chinese or Italians or Irish, that were really taken advantage of. They were treated as less than other people. Now, over time, we've made advancements. There's no doubt about that. And that's really one of the arguments against racism, is because they say, well, it's not like it was in 1960s, right? If you're black, it's not, and it was. It's not like it was back then, but it's still not equal. It's still not equal. And we might not see that because that's not our experience. But yet, if we talk to somebody who comes from rural Alabama and is a black person, they're going to have a different take on it from what we have. And certainly, when we take a look at equality, I mean, just taking a look at numbers, right? We can see that race plays a big role in socioeconomic status. Race plays a huge role in how healthy you are. Race plays a huge role in how long you will probably live. Race plays a big role in your access to food and your security for food. So those are the mega trends, and that's the facts, right? And what we've got is we've got a lot of people that will argue against that because they say, I've never owned a slave, right? I've I've never practiced racism, so don't tell me that I have a responsibility. And they'd be right too. They'd be right too. But maybe we need to look at a little deeper into our bias that I talked about first to understand it a little bit better. So that's really what we're talking about tonight. And I wanted to start off with this letter, this one section from the Ephesians. We're going to go back to a couple other places in the Bible too over the course of the night. Because to me, it speaks really clearly, the fact that what God is saying, God is plucking up the diversity of people, right? And then bringing those into salvation. And now we have to think about, what does that salvation look like? If God says, I'm going to pick a diversity of people and I want to redeem them all to me, what does the redeemed structure look like? And think about that. So does that mean we all become as what was our, what's that? Okay, thank you. My wife is able to watch it a little bit further. So Sherry Keys, we're going to come to you with a question. I saw your hand up. So, but what is this redeemed structure going to look like? In other words, are we all going to become brown? Because I can remember back in the 80s, they said, hey, given 50 years, we're all going to be brown in the United States. But the way that I look at it is, it's like, it's the redeemed structure, heaven, right? More than heaven, really. The kingdom of God, when heaven and earth are formed, it's going to look like a fruit salad. I mean, it's going to have all kinds of different things in it. We're going to maintain our individuality, but by having that individuality freely expressed, it's going to be amazing. It really is going to be amazing. So we can be of the same mind, right, and the same spirit, as Paul says, but yet we can still maintain those differences. So Sherry Keys, did you have a question?
Yes, like for racism and all of that and biases, why is it all said that it's in the name of religion? Like, where in the Bible, like last week you had said that the KKK had roots in Christianity and all of that.
Right.
Where are they getting that from to even say that?
They get it. They get it because some people read the Bible and they what they call proof text. Proof texting means that they read the Bible specifically to find a word or a phrase that justifies or supports them. And I can tell you that I can go through the Bible and I can find some pretty horrific stuff if I just want to take one phrase, right? I can point you to in the Psalms where it says that the babies of the enemies' heads will be dashed against the rocks with glee. That's pretty bad stuff, So Paul, as far as the most recent racism, black-white, let's call it black-white racism, that was Paul makes a comment in Galatians. Might be Galatians. I might be wrong on that one. But he, in one of his letters, he makes the comment saying, hey, it's an early letter because his early thought was that Christ was going to return immediately, right? So as he's teaching, he's saying, hey, don't worry about your lot in life, where you are, right? Spend your time not getting ready so that when Christ returns, that spiritually you'll be ready for that. And he says, if you're a slave, stay a slave, right? So that was used by the American slaveholders to say, well, look, it's God, God is proclaimed that there's going to be some people that are supposed to be slaves. So by owning them and taking care of them, we're really doing God's work. And so that was some of the justification. Actually, if you go to a black church and spend any time there, you'll see that they don't spend a lot of time reading out of Paul's letters in church, because it's really a problem. So that's the other thing is that there's And again, it's not in the Bible, it just becomes legend. You know, it's like the Catholic Church, they have all these saints, and like for each one of the apostles, they have the story of that saint. And you know, we just don't know. There's nothing in the Bible, and there's nothing in historical accuracy that we can say that this is where these people ended up and this is how they died. But the legend develops among that. So the legend has also developed among other stories in the Old Testament. So like we have, you know, the Esau, the brother, that he becomes the lost tribe of Israel, which are the black people, and you know, so it just gets, there's no evidence to it.
Thank you.
All right, I wanted to go and let me pull this up. So the other thing that we need to understand is that people appropriate religion for their own purposes sometimes. So we need to be careful about that. And this is where we get into the what I always talk about, the hermeneutic that we're going to read the Bible with. Some people I've used that term before, so some of you may have heard it from me before. A hermeneutic is basically the glasses, right? I can't, if I take my glasses off, I can see that there's shapes there, but I can't really see details. But I put them on, and it's like I see everybody's beautiful smiling face right there. So the hermeneutic is the glasses that help us focus. And it depends on what color tint that we have in it, the way that we're seeing it. So we always want to read with the hermeneutic of love, right? That God is love, and God's intention is for us to be in relationship with Him, and He wants our relationships to be reflective of that too. And that if we read something that's outside of that, or that doesn't lead us to that, we should be not that we should ignore it, but we shouldn't worry about that. We should really focus in on the core teachings and beliefs of love. If you don't do that, then you can get into proof texting, and you can really get off on some things and start to get pretty wild. And we all know that there's some religious leaders that really go off and do that. They're the same ones that would talk to you about a Methodist or an Episcopal or a Presbyterian church and maintain that we are not Bible based. They'll say, look, this is in the Bible. They're very literal about that, and really that the mainline churches, the Presbyterians, Methodists, and Episcopals, we've been at it for a long time, right? And this is going to sound bad, but we make our ministers go to seminary, to learn this stuff. And, but it can be really hurtful. And it also encourages people to take a very, very literal reading, and you got to be careful with it. Really got to be careful with that. So it's a struggle. You need to read the scripture, and you need to be comfortable with living in tension, which means that it gives you comfort, but it also makes you uneasy at times. And but once you can live with that, it becomes a lot more interesting to read it. Really, it does. Okay. The other thing is that we've got racism as a term, and that's really become misappropriated too. Just as religion and the gospel has become misappropriated, so has that word term racism. It's really become a derogatory term to throw at somebody. And really what it is just the scientific term is the fact that the world treated people and made decisions about people based upon race. That was the true meaning of it at first. And now it's become to reflect people that have hate in their heart, right? So if you accuse somebody of racism, it might just be a general rebuke to say, hey, are you making a decision based upon somebody's identity rather than their capability? But now it's been done with malice. You know, you're accusing somebody of openly opposing somebody and taking advantage of them. And remember this: if it's blatant, right? If it's blatant, it means somebody wants to hurt somebody. They might not, whether they don't feel that that person doesn't deserve it, or whether they think that, hey, I can take it, so that they do it. It's that blatant. And then the problem with that is that if we don't stand up against that, right, then we heard an awful lot about Martin Luther King last week. But he also said, you know, if you don't stand up against unjustness, then you're complacent in that. And so we really need to be careful about that. We need to be vigilant about that. And we need to understand that it's not showing itself in the same way today as it was in the 1960s or even the 1970s. So those mega trends that I talked to you about, you know, socioeconomic status, you know, the infant mortality rates, obesity rates, you know, all of these things are markers that if everything was equal, you know, other than some genetic predisposition, but if everything was equal, we wouldn't have these vast differences. You know, one of my biggest concerns in the United States is, and I never had this concern really until 6 years ago, was the fact that if we take a, do you know that we have the highest incarceration rate of people, of anybody in the world? That per capita, we put more people in prison than Russia does. And so much so that it's become an industry, you know, so when we take a look at that, and then we take a look at that fact that it's highly racial, right? Minorities represent the vast majority of people that are in our prisons. And that when we look at that, 60% of them are relatively minor, or I shouldn't say minor, or they're nonviolent, you know, nonviolent events. And then we take a look at saying if a 17-year-old white kid gets busted for pot and a black kid gets busted, but with the same amount, the white kid ends up being maybe on probation, right? If that, and the black kid ends up in prison. So there's a lot of inequality as far as the way that we treat people. And some of it is, it's true. It's because you say, well, you can't compare the incarcerations that are done in Metro Detroit with what's being done up in Flint or wherever, Lapeer County. And there's some truth to that too, but it doesn't tell the whole story. So there certainly does exist in our world a tremendous amount of difference in racism. And the church is either going to be a witness, right, for what God wants, which is redemption of everybody, or it's not church. So we have to be willing to speak out. I heard a story this last week. I met with Levon and Gloria King's son, Michael, right? And I know that most of you know about the Kings. But I heard the story. I didn't know this, but Levon was a United Church of Christ minister, I guess. And he was in Selma. He marched in Selma. That's amazing. You know, that's great. How many of you knew that?
We had Levon speak at our church about marching in Selma up to the youth group.
Yeah.
He spent a night in jail because of it.
Yeah, he was arrested.
Yeah.
And we were the first people that ever asked him about it. He said, this is the first time that anyone's ever asked me to sit down and talk about this, ever.
Wow.
That was years.
Yeah. Well, that's amazing.
Very interesting.
Anyway, so here I am. I've been just prattling on here, so I need.
Prattling.
So, I want to read. I want to read through this. How come I can't get that? There it is. So what we had today, this small reading, was an article that originally appeared in this thing called hermeneutics. I use that word hermeneutics, right? Remember, that's the lens with which we look through. And it was published in Christianity Today. Now, here's the interesting thing. Before I read this, you have to know this. This Bible study was actually produced by Christianity Today, which is one of the best known magazines, periodicals about Christianity, right? But it also is, it's very evangelical, right? So it's people that, evangelicals that tend to take a much more literal view of the Bible than what we do as mainline Protestants. In fact, and we can get put down by them. And I love this. One of the reasons why I picked this one is because I'm like, well, I've got to be careful with this one. I don't know. And then as I went through, is that they have minorities, and they want it. They called out themselves. The evangelicals called themselves out on this, saying, "Hey, we have missed the mark on this." Now, so this was really a spirit of truth that was speaking, and it was done back in back in the early 2010 era. And I don't think that, to be honest with you, I don't think that they listened too well. But sometimes you got to say things multiple times before it gets there. So let's read some of this, and we'll go through it. And the name of this is "You Don't Have to Say Yo Around Me." This is written by a Black person by the name of Trillia Newbell. So I'll read a little bit and then we'll stop and we'll talk a little bit about it. Even with the recent surge of attention given to issues of race and ethnicity, any attempt to enter a conversation on these issues comes with a degree of timidity. Can I say this? Am I allowed to use that word? How will he respond if I ask about blank? These kinds of questions can also come up around observations of Black History Month, as people consider ways to honor African Americans without resorting to stereotypes, cliches, or tokenism. Our reluctance to address race and to resign to safe silence often comes from a desire to respect others, but also from our own fear of being called insensitive, hurtful, or worse, a racist. That term comes with so much weight and penalty that people do not relate to it. There are few self-identified racists, though many in our country and our churches indeed struggle with racism. Our distance from this term hinders us from fully engaging with the issues of race. So think about that. I know when I read this, I'm like, oh, I was in seminary at the age of 42 with a bunch of 23 to 27-year-olds, right? There was in my class, there was 80 of them, and then there was about 10 of us old people. So we had to hang together. And when we were talking about feminism, right, and the feminist theology, I realized that one of the feminist theology is that not only is it an expression of how you can relate to God from a female standpoint, but it really also sits as a rebuke to the old white males that have dominated theology, and then because of their inherent bias have brought that into their theology too. So as we were sitting in these rooms having these great discussions about these things, I found out that I had just had to sit there and shut up, right? Because I was bringing that white maleness to the, and regardless, it was just the way that I had it. And I remember being so scared to say anything. It's like, man, who are these young girls that are, what do they know? They haven't lived life. I've lived life. I'm going to tell them what it's about. And then, you even go there a little bit and all of a sudden it's like piranhas are jumping on you. So I'm like, oh, I'm not saying a word. I'm not saying a word. And finally, and then like the section leader said, Tim, what do you think about this? And I said, you got to understand, in this instance, I said, I'm a middle-aged white male. I said, I just don't have a dog in this fight. I can't say anything other than the best I can do is sit here and listen and then understand, what's it like to be a young woman in the United States, and how do you relate to God in those instances. This is the same way with racism, because we don't say things because we're scared, right? That we might be accused of being a racist because of our unconscious bias. Anybody said that? Anybody ever chosen not to say anything or engage with somebody because you're like, oh, I don't know how that's going to be received?
First worked at Romulus Head Start. It was Black History Month, and I had grown up in Allen Park, and we know that it's not very diverse. So that was my first, experience with diversity, and I was not comfortable teaching Black History Month because I didn't want it to come off as just something I had to get through when 95% of my classroom was African American, and so were my coworkers. So I did have one coworker that I could speak freely and openly about and say, how can I do this in a respectful manner?
Right.
So but for the first few meetings, because we would have teacher meetings, I just sat there and listened. I didn't have anything to contribute, I guess. It was awkward at first.
How'd you end up with it?
I did well. I was disappointed at the lack of African American people you can point to and say, look and see what they've done, when I'm sure there were much more, but not in our history book.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's not a lot of history in the written books that we teach our kids in school. I've been friends for 35 years. There's a group of 5 of us. Three are black, 2 of us are white, and we never talked about racism. We never talked about racism until this last year. And I started researching and started trying to learn about the history. And they have to try to teach their nieces and nephews because they don't know how bad it was. And because they don't normally undergo racism, not on a normal basis, because they're little kids. My friend is worried about when they get older. The history is not being taught in the schools, and unless you have relatives that try to teach it to you, if you're African American, you don't know really that much about Martin Luther King and everything that happened in the past. It's not taught in public schools.
Do you think is one of the reasons why it's not taught the fact that they feel that would cause separation?
It's not written in the books.
Okay.
It's not pretty.
Yeah.
And I was friends. We worked together 35 years ago. We've been friends ever since. We've traveled, we've had dinners together. We live across the country, and we've never talked about racism until this year.
You guys take care.
Tim and everybody, especially Amy, the trouble's got to be until we can teach about Martin Luther King by John F. Kennedy and everybody else, and there is no real distinction that this person is black, this person is white, It's not going to ever work. It has to be equal in what we're teaching things and not putting it in a little compartment.
Mhm.
Why don't we stop using old textbooks? Who
Well,
uses
yeah, but
books?
that's what I'm saying. It has to be written as this is part of history. This person is just as important as this person. And that, yes, oh, they happen to be black. Oh, they happen to be Asian. They happen to be white. Should not really be an issue. Because as long as we keep making the distinctions that, oh, we have to include black people, that's like demeaning it. That's saying, okay, we're going to grab what we can and put it in.
Well, maybe because it's only 13% of our population, it's a small part of our population, and people just don't realize it. And it wasn't until, if I could, I'm sorry, I'm going to start to ramble. Maybe I should stop, and stop me if I should stop. But my friend, my black friend, her birthday is the day before mine. She's 5 years older than me. And George Floyd was killed on her birthday. And I called her, I texted her the day after, because my daughter warned me. She said, Mom, you better text your black friends and see how they're doing. And they weren't doing well at all. We never talked racism. It was never an issue because we just went out and had fun and whatever. And that's when they finally got honest with me. It took them 35 years to be finally honest that they are afraid. And I'm like near tears right now. It's really a shame. But, they're my good friends and we're talking, and I invited them to this conversation tonight. But I had no idea. You guys. We never talked about it before because it was never really a problem. Maybe because they're women. I don't know. They were black women. I don't know. But when I called my friend, how are you doing? 2 days after George Floyd was killed, I said, how are you doing? I said, I can't drive up north because my husband is worried about me driving with all the protest. And she said, Amy, how do you think I feel every day? And I was like, oh my goodness. And she has nephews in their teens that she's very worried about. That was like eye-opening for me. So I became very, I'm an activist now. And that's all I'm going to say. I'm going to stop. Sorry.
Well,
Thanks,
you.
Amy.
Thank you.
You had me crying there. Tim, it's
Now,
hard to hear you.
I think the other thing that we need to remember is we were talking about history books and why is it not taught. And this isn't a black-white thing. This is an issue about power, right? Power will do anything to maintain itself. People in power will do anything to maintain itself if it's threatened. So, I mean, we're kind of seeing that a little bit now, right?
And we can't hear you.
We're seeing that right now, lived out right in front of us, right? Because all of a sudden, you get more desperate. You start to make some really big things. It's like, well, I mean, we'll see what happens with the election, but I will tell you that every single thing that has been put forward so far about people saying, oh, I saw this kind of election fraud happening, that when it's been looked into, there's been nothing behind it, right? So, but again, I maintain that that's power saying, hey, we're going to do everything we can to keep it, even if it gets pretty ludicrous at times. But remember this is that, Martin Luther King, we talked about this last week, as great as he was and as nonviolent and the advocate for change, remember, he had, I mean, the FBI had a huge black file on him and they used it, right? we know that he had extramarital affairs. And so what was used is, well, you can't listen to him, that he's an adulterer, and even worse than that, he was told, stop doing this or else we're gonna, go back and just be a minister in your church, and we won't bring up these things that we have on you. And he knew that, and he made the decision to stand up for it. I heard the story this week. Nelson Mandela, in South Africa, he was the first Black South African president that was elected. But before that, he was in when Meg and I, when we went to Africa, we flew into Johannesburg, and we actually took a tour of Soweto, which is the in Johannesburg. When they went in apartheid, they moved all of the Black people into what the southwest portion of Johannesburg. So it's southwest. So Soweto is what it became known as. And that was, and it became in poverty, and they were living in, there was some decent housing, but there was an awful lot of shacks, and there was an awful lot of dormitories, because all the guys that worked for the diamond mines and the gold mines and things like that. So Nelson Mandela, he's got a rough side to him. He was leader of a street gang, and fighting against apartheid, and he ends up getting, but he rises above that. He becomes a leader in the thing, and then he ends up being thrown in jail, and he's beaten, he's tortured, and everything. And then he gets out of jail, and he ends up, when democracy comes, he becomes the first Black elected president of South Africa. So the story said that he decides, and Mandiba is what they called him locally. It was kind of a term of endearment, that they said that Mandiba decided that he wanted to go for a walk in the late morning, and as they walked, he had his security guards with him, and he said, let's stop for lunch. So they stopped for lunch, and as they're sitting at a table, they look across, and he sees a white guy, and who's sitting at the table, and he says, go ask him to come and join us. So the guy does come, and he really doesn't do anything but look down. He eats his food, right, and then mumbles something, and then goes. And the guard says, boy, I was watching him. He just made me really nervous. And he says, the guy, he was shaken in anger. And Mandela goes, no, he was shaking in fear. He said, that was the guard who used to torture me when I was in Robben Island. And so Mandela sees that, and he's forgiving. He's just saying, hey, I'm going to come and bring you in, and I want to show you that everything's fine. But this guy doesn't know how to handle that, right? It just blows his mind, and more so than that, he understands what he's done in the wrong, and he was wondering, how can I ever be forgiven for that? So that's where God comes into racism. The fight against racism is the forgiveness. And that's the hard thing, because we keep hearing about there's hardliners on both sides, both liberal and conservative, right? And they tend to grab all of the headlines. And but that's what happens with because we'll hear, oh, we have to give what they call it, not retribution, but reparations, right? And boy, that one will inflame even the calmest of white persons when they say, I got to get. So that doesn't go anywhere with changing it, right? Yet you'll have the liberal side of it said, hey, unless white people feel pain, then we don't have equality. I'm not so sure. But I do know that it has to begin with forgiveness, because that's what God did for us in Jesus Christ. And Paul bases all of what he says here in the fact that we can only do this because of who we are in Jesus Christ. And that means that, we have to forgive, and other people have to forgive us for what we've done. Anyway, so I want to keep reading here for a little bit, unless there's any questions. This is a person writing, I've written previously to challenge fellow Christians to evaluate their hearts to see whether pride and self-exaltation have fueled the sin of racism within them. I know racism is alive and well because I have met people who tell me they struggle with it. Over the past year, I've engaged with brothers and sisters who are willing to face their sin, repent, and ask God for strength to change. Many of these people, I believe, would continue to be complacent in their sin if some churches and organizations hadn't started to become more vocal over issues of race. When we are willing to have difficult and sometimes uncomfortable conversations, God works through them. Researchers have found that most evangelicals believe one of the most effective ways to improve race relations is to stop talking about race. This sentiment reveals how many of us would rather ignore race as a societal force as well as our own racial bias. That's a powerful sentence right there, right? Because I think it's accurate in the fact that we say, hey, if we just don't talk about it, then it doesn't exist, right? It more powerful than that. It's, well, if we don't talk about it, means that we're not implementing it anymore, right? So we're not continuing to perpetrate the racism. So therefore everything's okay. But we talked about bias, right? This unconscious bias, and that still exists. And so as a white person who's in power, I say, well, look, I'm not going to make jokes about Black people or Mexican people, and I'm not going to, and I'm going to treat everybody equally. So I'm fine, right? I'm fine. No, you could still be making some really horrible decisions based upon your unconscious bias. You got to the only way that unconscious bias comes to light and be exposed is if you sit and have some really uncomfortable conversations. And it means that we have to listen to the people who are on the side that we don't see. The other thing is they talk about, here's the problem with the evangelical church. If you go to any of these, and most of the big mega churches that you see around here, if you go to them, they're evangelical free, which means that they're non-denominational, and they're very much, quote, gospel centered, right? For a gospel church, and they're almost all overwhelmingly white too. They really are. You're not going to see a lot of racial diversity in those churches either. Religion, for whatever reason, still maintains one of the most race-defined organizations in the entire world, really. People tend to be drawn to churches that are much like themselves. Racial bias comes as a matter of instinct. What's your reaction when you see someone who appears to be of Middle Eastern descent boarding your plane, right? Now, we all see that around here. We have lots of Middle Eastern people. If you're walking in an urban area and a group of large Black men approach, what do you think? When you see a white male with a beard wearing skinny jeans in a coffee shop, how do you sum him up? Can all Black people dance? Are all Asians smart? Are all Africans living in huts with electricity? Does every white person in America live in the suburbs and drive minivans? He does a pretty good job here calling everybody out for the stereotypes that are around there. He says, I've experienced this kind of instinctual racial bias. Certain individuals meet me and feel afraid and feel the need to speak a certain vernacular. Yo, what's up? Or move in a way that was clearly something they picked up from watching television. I wasn't offended. I'm confident that with enough interactions, that bias will be unproven in my case. In another instance, when I was accepted into law school, someone declared that I must have benefited from affirmative action. Why wasn't hard work the first assumption? What do you think?
No.
I
You know,
think that probably happens all the time.
Well, but I tell you, I mean, who isn't scared if you know, if you're surrounded by a group of black people, right, and it seems threatening to you, you know, every nerve fiber in your body goes on alert, you know. It happens to me, right? And I mean, I'm a country boy, right? So and in Homer, they told me how terrible Detroit was. And well, and they told me how terrible Dearborn was too, because all the Muslim people were living there. So, and then because when I first got to Homer, I had to go into Henry Ford Health because we had somebody who had a lung transplant. So when I was going, the guy who was a police officer in the Homer church, he said, "Well, where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to Detroit." He goes, "Well, when are you going?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to go in Saturday evening." And he goes, "You better let me go with you." You know, and he went there and he had his firearm and all that stuff. So nothing happened. You know, when we got to Henry Ford, we found out that, you know, you pull up and they have a valet that comes and parks and everything. It is a rough spot. They told us don't go off campus, but you're safe in the hospital. You can do that. So, but it was a real eye opener for me. But I was more concerned because what everybody told me, what the other people were telling me. I had come to, that was my expectation. So go ahead. I'm sorry, Carrie.
I was just gonna say, I've had Barry go with me with his gun to Detroit to deliver stuff before, but I wonder if that's the same thing. It is, right? Like, how do you walk without fear?
Well, I mean, sometimes it's justified. You're going into a high crime area, you know.
Yeah.
Racism and stereotypes are based, at some point, they were based on an element of truth. It's just that they got, you know, it gets pulled out of proportion. So.
And I think what you're saying really hits home about what the people from a small town would be saying about Detroit and Dearborn. Because a lot of us have lived around here our whole life, so I guess we just don't hear it anymore because it's just the way it is, I guess. You know what I mean? But you were probably thinking, what am I getting myself into?
Yeah, well,
Trying not to think that, but.
Well, when you see how messed up their Facebook posts are, you're like, you know, I'm not going to believe a lot of stuff that they say. So, but I use that as an example from my own life, right? Because it's impacted me. When I had no idea, I just believed what I had been told, right? And so when I went to Detroit for the first time, I thought I was going to see a war zone. And it wasn't a war zone, you know? It was a city that's trying, but has had a lot of the deck stacked against it for a lot of reasons. And poverty and crime are part of it. But you know what? Poverty and crime are part of every major city in the United States. So it's now. I also know of some ministers who have decided to go live in the projects, you know, in those things. And I can't say that I would feel comfortable doing that either. So I know that I'm not perfect in this whole thing.
All right. You know who is a person who did that stuff was Bob Morton. He did stuff that he would go anywhere and do anything anywhere, never had any fear.
Bob and I had a lot of talks.
Yes, he also warned me never to go to Tent City, which is the sternest he was ever with me. He was serious.
So stereotypes versus reality. My father in the mid 60s was a warehouse district manager, and he wanted to hire a black guy who passed up the typing test and whatever other tests he had to pass. And he came home, and I'll never forget, I never ever heard him cuss or use a bad word, and he used the N word. He came home and he said, they would not let me hire this man because he's an N. And 5 years later, my mom, working as an office manager in Toledo, Ohio, affirmative action, she had to hire these black women who didn't have the best education, but she was forced to hire them. She was not racist, as my father was not, but she had to hire these women. Well, I'm sorry, they came from very poor public schools and they didn't have the best education. They couldn't spell correctly, they didn't use correct grammar. And she goes, I love these ladies, but they don't do the best work. And it made her feel really sad, because that was the system in the inner city. In Toledo anyways, they didn't have the best public education. So 1974, that's where I went and did my student teaching in an all-black elementary school in Toledo, thinking I could, try to do my part. Because neither one of my parents were racist. They did the best they could.
Mm-hmm. So that's a great lead in here to the next part of what this person writes. He makes this notation: we are easily influenced by culture, what we've read, seen, or heard about, but not experienced, and the attitudes and the belief systems of generations past. To see reconciliation and progress in our nation, communities, and churches, we must recognize that racial bias is indeed a possibility for each and every one of us. We then want to fight our assumptions of others, learn, and ask good questions. So where we are isn't our fault, right? We are products of our parents. We are products of the ideals that they had and the ideals that they brought. And we talked about this last week. I think, John, you talked about it. The fact that, you were living in a section of Detroit that the white people just fled from, and your parents said, "Hey, we're gonna do what's best for our kids," right? So,
Well, no, my dad was just tired of taking the bus from the east side of Detroit to Zug Island to work on the steel mill, and that's the reason we moved to Southgate. It wasn't because, in fact, we moved out in '59, and the first black family crossed over Connor Avenue, which the dividing line was St. Jean, and that was half a mile further away. And they burned them out. It was shocking to see, but that's not why we left. We left just because Ecorse was much closer to Southgate than it was to the east side of Detroit.
Yeah, that was when I took the kids out of Detroit and
Right,
we went to Sterling Heights.
oh, maybe it was your story. Yeah, maybe
Yeah.
it was your story. So put yourself in your kid's position, right? So they're saying, oh, well, there's reason to be afraid, right? And things are going to be bad. So they've got to get over that, right? And each one of us has had that. So we have that generational stereotype that we've got to deal with. And this is what the bias is, right? It's because that was ingrained into us. And this is the hard work, is just stepping up and recognizing, okay, what I was taught, right? Or maybe wasn't even actively taught, but it was just kind of absorbed because that was the environment. I have to question that. I have to question that and say if that's correct. So it is up to us to recognize it's up to us to to recognize our problematic assumptions and address our ignorance through the lack, the lack of understanding beneath much racial bias is not necessarily sinful. It can lead to an unbiblical mindset that favors your race over others. And once bias causes unwarranted judgment, anxiety, or fear, it plagues us as sin. This is the most difficult paragraph for me in this whole thing. I've gone back and read this thing 5 times and I still can't get my arms around it. So, sometimes people, so I usually when things are written and you can't get that, it means that the writer is struggling with it too. So I'm not quite sure what the message is in that paragraph. Does anybody have an idea?
My parents were not racist in the American sense of the word. But by God, if you were a Catholic, you were much lower than we were.
Yes.
And it was the way they were brought up. And I tried, when I first moved to Southgate, I was invited out for a Thanksgiving. The first question my mother asked me about the young lady was, what religion is she?
Mhm.
And I said, how the heck do I know? I go to Southgate High. And she said, yeah, but what church did you go to? I said, I have no, that's not a topic that we discuss at school. But it was from their mindset. When you grew up in Scotland or in Ireland and you went to St. So-and-so's, you were Catholic. And if you went to the other school, you were Protestant. And the Catholic kids walked down the right-hand side of the street. The Protestant kids walked down the left-hand side of the street and they went to the respective schools. And you have to, I looked at it and I thought, well, I understand what the trouble is. If the person on that side of the street is going to that school, there must be something wrong with them because everybody that I know goes to this school and we're all okay. So they must be all wrong. And it was one of the Irish guys I met and he was talking about it. He was talking about his experience in college. And he said, the first time I ever got together with a Protestant that wasn't in a fight was when I was in college. Other than that, we were just mutual enemies. And I see the same thing with the black and the white in the United States. But in Europe, that's not necessarily the case. Their prejudice is there, but the prejudice is against something else. I mean, look at Germany in World War II.
Yeah.
It was, if you were Jewish, you were bad. And, how do you tell if he's Jewish or not? Drop his pants and to be circumcised, off to the camps.
Mm-hmm.
And in the United States, that's hard to imagine because over here, we were doing it for health.
Right.
But in Europe, they still had the circumcised and the uncircumcised.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of that was built into the system.
Yeah.
And that's what I assumed that he was talking about when I read that.
And when we're talking about racism, we're using the example that's in front of us most often, which is black, white, but actually, if we take a look at what's happening right now, it's really Middle Eastern, and white is something that, and in some ways, like I'm still finding out about the history of Dearborn. It just blows my mind, that you guys all know about it a lot more than I do. But
You've been here when Camp Dearborn was here.
Yeah, I know. But to see how that they actively were able to work, and the fact that Inkster ends up what it was because they said, well, we're going to give that piece of property up to keep them out of our central portion of Dearborn here, and then, but then of course, as much as Hubbard worked against having blacks, it ended up being the Arab Americans that came in and made such a significant thing. And it ends up being it's the most diverse town in the United States, almost, when we take a look at percentage stuff. So, but what we're coming back to is we need to understand that the racism is a lot more than just the, black, white. It could be anything. It could be the Chinese, right? And then like the all of the Eastern European immigrants that came in were treated, like dirt, back in the 1890s up until the 1940s, really until World War II. And then all of a sudden there was some equality that was gained. But the separation between races, between the white and the blacks, have just maintained itself. So there's always been racism that has been ethnic based, but that's been blended in, and but this racial based on the coloring has been really a problem. What do you got, Amy? You're pointing to somebody.
Margot.
Hi, Marco.
Margot, you're muted.
You
Yeah.
got her.
Okay. I just wanted to tell you about a friend of mine, actually my friend's son, is a high school teacher in Hamtramck. He graduated with his teaching degree, and that's where he got his first job. And boy, he had a rough time because Hamtramck is hugely culturally diverse. There's every ethnic group there, every nationality there. And he said the blacks, this is a quote, the blacks and the browns hate each other. And I don't know what constitutes brown other than like
Lighter-
Middle East,
lighter-
Middle Eastern or
Lighter skin
something.
black.
Oh, okay. Anyway, it's just interesting to hear
Yeah.
what he was dealing with. And he's lily white, grew up in
Yeah.
Woodland.
So-
It was an eye opener for him. It was
And
interesting.
Meg is on here with us, I think. So, or maybe she's. I know my son Chris called, so she muted herself. But so I was telling you about when we were in Johannesburg and we did this tour of Soweto, right? This slum, but it's more than a slum. As I said, there's actually a couple very nice houses. It's also where 2 Nobel Prize winners live. Nelson Mandela was there, and then Archbishop Desmond Tutu, right? They actually lived on the same street. And so it's the only place where that's happened. So as we spent the whole afternoon there, and I learned about apartheid, and the person who was taking us through was a black guy who had been raised there into it. And I made a couple comments that were like things like Nelson Mandela's wife, Winnie, she was really, she was really rough. While he was in prison, she ends up running the country, right? We're running I shouldn't say the country, running the black part of Soweto, and she actually had a couple people killed, right? And so when I bring it up, I mentioned to him, and this guy stops and looks at me and says, "That's the mother of our country. Don't you say that about her." And then 10 minutes later, as we're leaving, right, I go, "Oh," I said, "Look, on the side of the hill, there's a place that's really, really, ramshackle." I said, "You didn't tell us about that." He goes, "Oh, that's where," he goes, that's where the Browns live." And I said, "What do you mean the Browns?" He says, "Brown people." And he said it with such distaste in his voice. I'm just like, wow. So it's still, racism exists. Here's in the middle where people have been oppressed for years and years, and now, and then even between oppressed people, they're saying there's different classes of it, right? So we got a big problem in the world. It's not just us here, believe me. We've solved for things to get better. We haven't solved the problem, but we've improved it. The patient's better than it was. Maybe not on his deathbed, but it's still there. All right, I want to finish up. Oh, go ahead, Beth. Yeah.
Just what you're saying about, yes, that you can distinguish between black and brown, that man and stuff with it. That is where a lot of it in this country comes from, because, all right, you had the rural whites that mostly in the South that didn't have any money. And yes, that gave them a feeling that they were superior to some group if you're totally against black. And it kind of goes up step by step, that if you feel like you're nothing, you got to find somebody that should be below you, so you're not the bottom tier.
So we've talked about our situation. We've talked about church. We talked about how church has sometimes actually hurt, hurt racial equality, and sometimes has stood up for it. I will tell you that the Presbyterian Church has a history of standing up on the right side, of being on the right side of history, about 20 years before the rest of society catches up. So I often say that when we're in some uncomfortable thing that we're pushing through the General Assembly, and I'm like, I don't know whether we're ready for that. But then I say, well, you know what? We've been right. We were right on an awful lot of other stuff. So maybe there's prophetic words that God is speaking through it too. So, but this author comes to a conclusion here and says, just like we talked about in other countries, she says there's nothing new under the sun, because we can even look into a gospel account. We can see that there's racism that was being practiced at the time of Jesus, and Jesus taught about it. And that is, it's the story of the Good Samaritan, right? How a Jewish person was walking along the road, is beset by some robbers and beaten and left in a heap on the side of the road. And the first person that comes through is a priest. And the priest, rather than even, you would think, well, they're both Jewish, so he should take care of him. And he sees it, and he's worried about becoming unclean by touching, because blood, dam is the Hebrew word. But if blood would make him unclean, and of course he's got to stay pure because he's a priest. So rather than doing anything, he walks as far as he can off to the other side of the road and goes past him and doesn't do a thing. And then a Levite comes in, who's basically, they're the group that takes care of the temple. Again, very concerned about cleanliness, does the same thing. And then it says that a Samaritan comes by. The Samaritans are the people that the Hebrew people were at war with for generations and generations, and they absolutely hated them. They absolutely hated one another. And he comes across this Jewish man and sees him, and he stops. And he picks him up and he cleans him up. He gives him water, puts him on his donkey, takes him to a hotel, and tells the innkeeper, I need a room. And then the next day says, I have to be going. He seems to be doing better. Here's some money that paid, and please take care of him. And if he needs anything else, pay for it, and I will repay you when I come back through town again. So Jesus is telling this story, this parable, to a group of Pharisees. And he says, which one of these people was a neighbor to that man? And he says, oh, by far. He says it was the Samaritan was. He says, right, go and do likewise. Go and do likewise. The lesson in it is the fact that we will always take care of those people who are like us because we feel a kinship with them. We feel a brotherhood with them. We feel that they are our family. It's easy to extend our family to people that are like us. I love each and every one of you. And if you called me at 3 o'clock in the morning and said, I got a problem, can you come do it? I would do it. Right? I would do it. And you would for me too. But then what we've got is would we do it for anybody? And the answer to that is just no. I mean, we wouldn't. We wouldn't. So, we had the lesson there is the fact that, we will go out of our way because we have this bias that's sitting in here. But that Samaritan was the one person who said, I am going to define who my neighbor is. Because God tells us that we have to love God, love the Lord our God with all of our heart, all of our mind, all of our soul and strength, and to love our neighbor. And so he was able to redefine who his neighbor was to include people that weren't like him. And that's what we have to do. That's the lesson. All right, I'm done talking for the night. But what do you guys? Do you guys have anything?
Thank you.
This is so difficult.
Thank you.
So difficult.
Yeah. So we got more next week, and probably the week after that too. Then we'll do something Christmassy. How's that?
There we go. Hey, it's good to be uncomfortable. There's peace in the truth. You just have to go through the rough part to get there.
Right. That's where our growing is. Where our growing is.
Tim, I did end up recording this, thanks to Margot reminding me.
Oh, good.
I sent these to a couple people, the actual Zoom. So they got to watch the entire Zoom.
All right, I did download the other one. I put it up on YouTube under the Bible.
Yeah. Okay.
So we just didn't want to have it going live over Facebook where anybody can see. All right. So you guys ready to close in a prayer? All right. Let's pray. Lord, sometimes we get uncomfortable. And, you know, the late John Lewis used to say, it was good trouble. And I think when we get uncomfortable, it's because we've caused some good trouble in ourselves. We've questioned whether we've made right decisions, whether we've been fair, whether we've really been disciples in all that we do. And the danger in that is that we convict ourselves. But the good part is that we recognize the fact that we need to do better. So Lord, when we come to difficult times like this, Lord, let us not concentrate on the feeling of being convicted and in the wrong, but rather let's look at it and realize that each and every day from this point forward can be different. And that when we do that, we're looking through the lenses of the light of Christ. So we thank you for this evening. We thank you for putting us together. We thank you for working through the rough things. And then, Lord, giving us the promise of your grace and your mercy, and especially the resurrection that we have to the eternal life. We know that you're redeeming this creation, which means that it's each and every person that's on here that you knew before they were even born. And that we're part of that. So thank you for the blessings that we have in this life. And let us work with a renewed strength and vigor that we might go out and make a difference in the world ourselves. We ask this in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right. God bless you all.
Amen.
Thank you,
Thank
Tim.
you.
Thank you,
You're welcome.
everyone.
Thank you.
Night.
Thank you.
Night.
Good night, everybody.
Right.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
I'll see you at 9 o'clock.
All right. Yep.
I'll be there. Yes, you are.
Bright-eyed, bushy-tailed.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night.